Welcome back to the Postpartum Plan Podcast. This podcast is designed to support and empower you through postpartum. Whether you're expecting, in the early postpartum days, or beyond, this space is for you. I'm your host, Madison Fugere, a dedicated postpartum doula and pediatric sleep consultant, striving to help parents feel confident and supported in their parenting journey. Each week, I'm sharing practical tips and expert advice to help you navigate all the postpartum things with confidence. Well, as much confidence as you can. Let's embark on this journey together, making your parenthood as serene and supportive as possible. Shelly is a licensed practical nurse, sleep consultant, and international board-certified lactation consultant. Based in the Worcester County of Massachusetts, she has a busy private practice supporting new families in Massachusetts and Rhode Island with infant feeding and sleep since 2007. Shelly is also the host of the Baby Pro podcast, where she talks about everything and anything related to pregnancy through the first year of your baby's life. When not supporting families, Shelly also enjoys knitting, hiking, and traveling with her family. This is Shelly's second time on the podcast, so if you want to go back and listen to her first episode with me on tongue ties, you can check out episode 12. Hi, Shelly. Thanks for coming back and joining me.
My pleasure. This is always fun.
I know. When I kind of always am adding things to the topic list for the podcast, and I feel like lactation is just one of those that has so many different parts to it. Sleep and lactation, I feel like there's so many different aspects to it. And so trying to pick one aspect to tackle on a podcast episode is so hard. But I've had a couple people struggle and wonder about bottle refusals. And I was so interested to kind of get your insight and your expertise on, babies refusing bottles and breasts, and is it really a refusal and a rejection, or how do we navigate those things? So yeah, do you want to kind of just jump right in?
Yeah, sure. And I'm glad that we're talking about this topic too, because I think a lot of families, more and more families know about lactation consultants and how we can help, a lot of families don't know that we can help with bottle feeding too.
Yes.
And I actually kind of hate that we're called lactation consultants. I wish we were called infant feeding specialists, because we work with formula feeding, combo feeding, and breastfeeding parents, exclusive pumping parents, kind of the whole umbrella.
Right. I think that's so true. I think so many people think, yeah, lactation and oh, I'm not breastfeeding. They're gonna, try to force me to breastfeed. And in reality, most and good lactation consultants should be, supporting whatever your goals are and helping you meet those goals, right? Whether that is breastfeeding or that is bottle feeding, or it is a combination of both. I think that's so important to note. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that. Yeah.
Yeah, so just for some background, I do a lot of bottle consults with family, both breastfeeding, chest feeding, and formula feeding families. And there are some things that I've noticed as yellow flags for a bottle refusal, and then red flags for a bottle refusal. So I don't know if you just wanted to start there.
Yeah, that'd be great. Tell us a bit about what you typically see. And, I guess my first question actually would be I get asked so often, and I think every provider gives a different number, but people are always saying, okay, I really want to breastfeed my baby, but I don't want to introduce a bottle too early because then I'm afraid they're going to reject the boob. So I guess my first question is is there really this nipple confusion? I have heard no, I believe no, but I'd love to get your stance. Is this nipple confusion really a thing? And then when we are talking about bottles, when are we introducing those in order to make sure that we aren't having those bottle refusals that we'll kind of get to in a second?
Yeah, great question. I don't necessarily believe in nipple confusion. I do think that flow preference does exist.
Absolutely.
However, so if you have a baby that is struggling with breastfeeding for whatever reason, and it may not even seem like they're struggling with breastfeeding, but maybe they're just working hard at breastfeeding. And then they are offered a bottle, and the bottle is very easy for them. It doesn't require much work. The flow is continuous. Well, babies are kind of hardwired to take the path of least resistance to get their
Right.
food, right? It's an evolutionary survival tactic. And so for some babies, they will start to prefer the bottle because to them, they have to work hard. They don't have to work as hard as they do at the breast, and they're saving their energy, they're saving their calories. And that's when they can start to reject the breast as well. But it's not so much, for me, it's not so much the bottle that's the problem. It's the reason why they are finding breastfeeding so difficult.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Because you can blame the bottle, but babies like to breastfeed. So if your baby isn't enjoying breastfeeding, why? That's where we need to start.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so do you find that typically people are so early on introducing the bottle, and that's kind of what quickly is making them think, oh, baby just prefers the bottle, doesn't like the boob, refuses the breast, or doesn't like to chest feed or whatever that may be. Do you find that happens often earlier on rather than later? And then is there a sweet spot on when you suggest offering a bottle?
I would say both. I do work with babies who struggle with the bottle or going back and forth between breast and bottle in the beginning. But I would say that 80% of my bottle consults are with babies who were taking the bottle just fine and then suddenly stopped taking it. And they tend to be a little bit older, quote unquote, like 3 months, 2 to 3 to 4 months.
Yeah, gotcha.
So as for like if there's a magic time to introduce the bottle, that is going really to depend on a variety of factors that is individual for each baby.
Right.
So for example, going back to like a list of yellow flags that I keep in my head, if your baby struggles, for example, with the pacifier, if you find that they don't like the pacifier, if they have a hard time holding it in the mouth, it's always popping out, they gag when you put it in their mouth, that is a yellow flag that your baby may struggle with a bottle.
Mm,
If your baby makes clicking or smacking sounds at the breast, that is a yellow flag that they may struggle with the bottle. If you are told that your baby has a high palate or a tongue tie, that is a yellow flag for bottle refusal further on down the road, even if they're not refusing the bottle at that time.
right.
So if I'm working with a baby who's young, like first or second week of life, and I'm noticing these things, because that's one of the questions I always ask parents is, does your baby take a pacifier? Do they like taking it? Do they have any problem keeping it in their mouth? And the parents are saying yes, and I'm noting that the baby has a high palate, and the parents are telling me the baby was diagnosed with a tongue tie while in the hospital. I'm going to tell the parents, I know all the literature out there in the class that you took for breastfeeding says don't introduce the bottle until 4 to 6 weeks. I'm going to tell you to introduce it now, or at least 2 weeks at
Right.
2 weeks. Because if that baby is going to struggle with the bottle, we want to find out sooner rather than later.
Right, right. That's a great point. I think it's so important to kind of like, whether you act on all the information that you're given or not, just to like gather it all and like have somebody like you to be able to come in and kind of decipher all of that and like put it all together and be like, okay, now this is the right action plan, right? And I know on the other episode we did together, I think we talked a lot about like not necessarily jumping to conclusions, but like gathering that information in order to, decide what makes the most and eliminating things that it couldn't be right along the way. And trying other things before kind of jumping to those conclusions. So I think that it's so beneficial to have somebody like you or like any type of lactation consultant that you can trust to come in and be like, okay, these are kind of the flags that we're looking for and to be able to then trust them when you say, yeah, let's give it a shot now, because you're right. Everything that they've probably been taught and told is to wait until 4 to 6 weeks or to not introduce a pacifier at all in the first little bit. And, that it can cause all these confusions or, can make an issue down the road or, the pacifier doesn't stay in their mouth because it's actually just too heavy. There's so many things that people hear. And I think that they get so confused on like, what is the real truth, right?
Mhm. Right. And it's kind of scary for new parents to take these classes and read these books. And it feels like pacifiers and bottles are like almost vilified in the breastfeeding literature and the breastfeeding classes. And they're just like any other tool, right? When you use
Right.
them appropriately, they can be helpful. When you don't use them appropriately, they can cause problems.
Yes, I think that is poster right there. Like, make t-shirts for it. I think that's right on point. And I think that the idea that every baby is going to have a different timeline and best time to introduce a bottle is so frustrating to so many because I think we're just in a world where we expect to do A and B and get C as an answer, right? Like we want to be
Mhm.
able to be told what to do to be able to fix a problem or not have a problem in the first place. And so with babies, it's one of those things where it is just so much trial and error and see how it goes. And one day is never the same as the next, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Now, those are some like yellow flags that you'll see when you're working with people really early on. And are you typically seeing these people early on because they're worried about some breastfeeding things? Or have you seen, I know you mentioned sometimes down the line, when you try to introduce a bottle, like a couple months in, baby may have been doing great feeding and then has a bit more of an issue. So are you finding people typically come before they have an issue, or is it more often that people are coming to you because they're having a breastfeeding struggle or a bottle feeding struggle and then are needing assistance?
So in the early weeks, it's usually they're struggling with breastfeeding. And as we're addressing it, I'm seeing these yellow flags and I begin that discussion with them about the bottles too.
Yep.
Um, then I see most of the people who book the appointment who specifically because their baby is rejecting the bottle, the baby is always usually closer to 2 to 4 months old.
Gotcha.
Not
And that's when you see
always.
those red flags, right? Because
Yeah,
we're
at that
really in
point,
the
the baby
depths
is
of it.
like, yeah, just refusing the bottle. And that's usually when a formula feeding families contact me
Yep.
as well, because, usually, like I mentioned before, many babies will take the bottle just fine until they get to 2, 3, 4 months and then they stop. And it's always like, oh, I didn't even know lactation consultants would work on this. Like, or
Right.
I was afraid to book the appointment because I didn't want to be judged for formula feeding. And I totally get that. But it's important to remember that and this is what I tell parents who are coming to me when their baby's like 2, 3, 4 months old, and they're like, well, the baby always took the bottle in the beginning just fine.
Right.
Your baby has a very strong suck reflex when they're born. And basically, you put your finger in their mouth, you put the pacifier in their mouth, you put the bottle in their mouth, they're going to suckle. You put the breast in their mouth, they're going to suckle. That is a reflex that they have that helps them survive. It helps them eat. They start to lose that reflex between 2 and 4 months. That goes away.
Mm,
And so all of a sudden, they can be choosy about what they want to suckle on. Whereas
right.
before that suck reflex kind of like overrode what they
Yep.
wanted. And it was like, yeah, I'm gonna suck all on that pacifier, that bottle if you put it in my mouth. The other changes that are happening about that time is their oral cavities, their mouths are a lot bigger than it was when they were
Mm,
1 or 2 or 3 weeks old, right? So when they're in the early weeks, their tongue pretty much fills up their entire mouth. But then as
right.
their mouth gets bigger, there's a lot more room in there, and their tongue is able to move in a lot of different ways. And for some babies, that can confuse them. And
Mm,
I'll say, I'll be working with parents and I'll say, well, she'll accept the nipple in her mouth, but then she'll just push it side to side with her tongue.
yes.
Yeah.
I've
So
totally
at
seen
this, yes.
it.
Or they'll just chomp down. They'll
Right. Or
chomp
they're
down.
playing, it looks like they're playing with it. Right.
Yes. Like, and sometimes it'll be like, it's like they forgot how to suckle on the bottle. That is because that sucking reflex went away. And at the same time, the mouth got a lot bigger. And sometimes we have issues because the throat structures are changing around that time too. They're dropping, they're spacing out. And so um, some of the protections they had against like choking and coughing while feeding kind of start to go away a little bit. So
Yep.
sometimes it's not a sucking issue. It's like for some reason the baby's feeling overwhelmed with the flow. And that's like a totally different
Mm,
issue, but I work with that too. But
yeah.
that's why sometimes your baby can take a bottle very well, and then all of a sudden they're like, no, thank you. I'm never going to do that again for you, which
Right.
can be really stressful for family.
Yeah, because it can often be an overnight thing. And then often that time frame is also lining up with babies going through, a 4-month sleep regression or a developmental leap that parents are especially new parents are experiencing for the first times, and so they don't know what it's supposed to truly be like, right? And so it can be just this, oh well, I guess this is supposed to happen, and then all of a sudden you're like, okay, but now they're like dropping weight, or they're really refusing, or they're super fussy because they're hungry, or they're waking up more at night. And I think that those all of those things together can be, yeah, overwhelming is an understatement, I think, right? I mean,
Mhm.
it's nerve-wracking when you're trying to do everything you can for a little one and they're just not cooperating with what they
Right.
want.
And you know what else is going on around that time? Mom's going back to work,
Right.
right? So the stress level in the house is high, understandably so. That
Yeah,
doesn't really help the situation. And then what's the first
absolutely.
thing you do? You jump online and you Google, why won't my baby take a bottle? Or how
Yep.
can I get my baby to take a bottle? And the problem with that is a lot of the information online blame the baby's personality
Mm,
or even put blame on the mom. You know, like,
right.
oh, it's because you're home and baby wants it straight from the tap. I'm speaking of like breastfeeding families in
Yeah.
the situation, obviously. But you'll read like, oh, mom has to just leave the house,
Yep.
or just do a lot of bouncing or distracting, or offer it when the baby's tired, or don't worry about it at all because when the baby gets hungry enough, they will take the bottle. And that's when I always go back to the fact babies are hardwired to eat. If they're not taking a bottle, there's a reason why. And it's not because they're stubborn. It's not because they're trying to manipulate you. Something is physically going on with them where they're like, I cannot do this. And they're trying to do a skill that they don't know how to do. So baby gets frustrated, parents get frustrated, and it just leads to a lot of frustration and stress.
Some babies are eating great as newborns, and then at that 3, 4 month or whatever mark, they start refusing the bottles. Are there any like signs for those babies while they are eating well that we can kind of notice in order to know ahead of time that they may start refusing these bottles? Or is it typically kind of just an out of the blue thing?
It can be just an out of the blue thing for many babies. So I would look at again, like some of the yellow flags. If you're seeing these yellow flags, even though your baby may be taking the bottle well, if they don't like the pacifier, if they're clicking on the bottle, if milk's leaking out, if their eyebrows go up and their fingers
Mm,
splay while they're taking the bottle, if they arch their back, when it's not suddenly, what I usually hear parents say is the baby just starts taking gradually less and less
mm,
from the bottle until they're not taking it at all. Or
interesting.
another thing I hear parents say commonly is that it takes them longer and longer and longer for the baby to start the bottle. Like the baby used to latch on right away now, and then it starts taking like a minute or two to get the bottle latch, and then 5 minutes to get the baby to latch onto the bottle. So those are typically what I see when it's not just an overnight switch.
Gotcha. So it's the same kind of like cues, and for some babies, that causes them to refuse it really early on, and they're, showing these signs and refusing to feed from a young age. And for others, they're feeding, but they're still showing some of these signs, and therefore, just keep your eyes out because that may be something that they,
Correct.
gotcha, gotcha. Very interesting. Because it is, I
Sure.
think that again, there's so many things that people are like, oh, well, yeah, they click, but like they're still eating like they're eating fine. And that's great. Like if you're cool with that, then sure. But just like you said, exactly, like it might be something that comes up down the line. So it's good to like know those signs, right?
Right.
Um, Now, if babies are refusing these bottles, is there anything that parents can do like while they're at home themselves to kind of like try to help their baby take the bottle? Or is it something that typically a lactation consultant does need to look at in order to pinpoint the exact issue that they're struggling with?
I think it's a little bit of both. It's important when your baby is having trouble with the bottle that we find the right bottle for your baby. And that is going to depend on your baby's age and oral anatomy and how they're sucking and swallowing.
Mm.
So most of the time when parents come to me, by the time they come to me, they have like bought every single bottle
Oh,
on the market
absolutely.
and it's yeah, amount of money on bottles. And it's really hard because of the marketing that's out there. Like there are all the bottles that tend to be marketed to be like breasts, quote
Hmm.
unquote, tend to be the worst bottles. So think the really wide base bottles with the skinny nipples that just stick up, or really weird shaped bottles. And those bottles can work really well for a lot of babies. But if you have a baby, for example, with like a high palate or an exaggerated gag reflex, it's not going to work well for them.
Right.
If they have swallowing issues, it's not going to work well for them. But what you can do, one of the things that I would try is not trying to force the baby to take the bottle, not trying to starve them out to take the bottle. We want the bottle, learning to take a bottle, to be a really enjoyable experience for them. Because if you're trying to force them and they don't want to, or they feel like they can't, then you're going to push from bottle refusal to bottle aversion. Now, the difference is babies who have bottle aversion refuse to even attempt. As soon as they see that bottle in your hand, they start screaming and turning their head away, like they're afraid of it. Whereas bottle refusal, they will at least make an attempt, but for some reason they can't. And that's when they'll do like the side to side or whatnot,
Yeah.
right? Bottle aversion takes a lot more steps to overcome than bottle refusal.
Mm.
So you don't want to end up in bottle aversion. And the only time that I see babies have a bottle aversion is if the parents were incorrectly advised to try to force them or, kick the mom out of the house all day and then the baby will just get hungry enough. It's not a good combination for babies.
Right, right.
So
Because
try
at that
not to,
point they're stressed out, I'm sure.
yes. Yeah. And if you're like learning a new skill and you're super stressed, you're not going to learn much, right? The other
Right,
point is don't try the bottle when the baby's hungry. If you're hangry, are you going to learn anything new?
right.
No.
Exactly.
So when you're
Thank you.
practicing the bottle, it should be after breastfeeding, if you're breastfeeding or however else you're feeding the bottle. I've met babies who, I had a 6-month-old that I worked with once who was only taking breast milk popsicles. That was
Oh,
the only way he could eat. And we did get him taking a bottle. So parents come up with a lot of creative ways too. So
yeah.
while you're working on like getting the baby fed, don't try to use the bottle to feed the baby. We want positive experiences with the bottle, not negative ones. So
Mm,
try in between feedings or right after a feeding to get them more comfortable. And I would just start with the bottle nipple. Like take the bottle nipple out of the bottle, tap baby's cheeks, tap baby's lips, boop, 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 make silly faces, silly voices, make it fun, and just encourage them to suck on it. Don't worry about the milk right now or the formula right now that's going to go in the bottle. Just get them to suck on the nipple. If they do, praise them. It's a game. It's fun. It's light and happy. Play your favorite music while you're doing it, but make it a positive experience. And then if your baby starts progressing, they start sucking on the nipple when you do that, then start dipping the nipple in milk and see how they respond. If they do well with that, then put like half an ounce to an ounce in the bottle and see how they respond. If they have a negative reaction, take a step back and stay at the previous step for a little while. Because remember, we don't want negative reactions. We want to keep it light and fun. And if you're finding that you can't progress past a certain step, that's when you need to call in support with another
yeah.
BCLC.
And I think it's also that just makes me think so much about, I think trying to identify it early on is really helpful or not struggling with it for an extended period of time. And I say this especially if parents are going back to work, right? If baby's so used to breastfeeding and then you're trying to get them on a bottle and it's their like a day before they're going to go to someone else for childcare or, the day of. I've had so many kids when I was in daycare that have been dropped off. Oh, they had a bottle like once or twice when they were a couple weeks old, but like they mostly exclusively breastfed. Here you go. I don't know which bottle they'll take. And it is so hard because in those moments, then parents are going to work, right? And then you're just even more stressed that your baby's not eating and somebody
Mhm.
else is trying to work through this with your child. And now you're stressed so that if you are pumping, like that's not going to help with your milk supply, right? And so I think that for so many people, the process gets so stressful, whether it's happening during them being at another child care center or place, but also even if you do it like a week before, right? Because sometimes it takes time. And I think people are so rushed to be like, oh, this needs to be done by X date and we need to figure it out by this time frame. And if we don't, it's going to be so horrible, right? Um, and so I think that if people are able to do it earlier on, it can be a lot more a lot better, I guess you could say,
Mhm.
lot less stressful, right?
Yeah. And being consistent about it too. So if your
Right.
if your baby is taking a bottle, fine. even if you're breastfeeding or mostly breastfeeding, you still want to offer a bottle at least twice a week to remind the baby, here's the bottle, food comes from the bottle too. It's all cool and good. When I see, well, a lot of times what I see is families who will go on a trip or they get sick. And so they don't offer a bottle for a week or two. And then they go to offer the bottle again. And that's when they find out, like, oh, now the baby won't take it. And
Absolutely.
I would say about half the bookings for bottle consults that I get, um, the parents like, it's a Friday and I'm going back to work on Monday.
Yep.
It's probably not going to happen by then, to be honest.
No,
Sometimes I can get the
takes some
baby to take
time.
the bottle in the actual visit, and it's good. But for the most part, we need to address the root cause of the issue, why your baby's not feeling comfortable with the bottle. And those tend to be not easy issues that can be fixed overnight. I would say 90% of the babies I work with are taking a bottle within 2 weeks, but yeah, it can take 2 weeks.
Right. Right.
So booking the consult on Friday, having to go back to work on Monday is very stressful.
Yeah.
And we'll usually spend some time talking about here are other ways to feed your baby while we work on the bottle,
Right.
because the chances of your baby taking a bottle by Monday is not great. Not
Absolutely.
impossible, not zero, but not great either.
Right, right. And to then just stress it even more all weekend isn't going to help anybody.
Right.
I think that's so, so important. Now, one other thing, because you mentioned bottle aversions as well. And is there a way for babies to have breast aversions as well or breast refusals? And kind of is that similar cues and red flags and yellow flags to what we see with bottle? Or what kind of flags do we look for in those if babies are starting to have, issues with breastfeeding or chest feeding?
In my experience, most babies who develop a breast aversion, it's because they had some sort of negative experience at the breast. A lot of times that can be they're having difficulty managing the flow. So
Mm,
there's some similarities to bottle and breast refusal and aversion, but it's not quite the same. Usually babies who are struggling to latch on the bottle and they breastfeed just fine.
mm,
The issues that are impacting them from feeding the bottle are still there when they go to the breast, but as not as intense or not impacting the feeding as much. When
gotcha.
babies are at the breast and when they are at the bottle, they are using the same muscles to
Mm,
suck and feed, but they're using them in very, very different ways. So when they go to the breast, the way they use their muscles might not make them feel uncomfortable at all. But then when they
mm,
go to do it at the bottle, it just changes things. So if you have like a super fast flow, if your baby's very refluxy, if they're coughing and sputtering at the breast, if they arch their back and cry, that might indicate that your baby might eventually start to refuse the breast as well.
mm,
Most of the time when I see babies refusing the breast, it's because of swallowing and airway issues, or they have just become they severely prefer the bottle. And again,
mm.
then you have to question why.
Why?
A lot
Right.
of times it can be low milk supply, so they're not getting a whole lot at the breast, and that's why.
Absolutely. That's so great to know. I've had a couple clients that have experienced bottle refusals. I've had some clients that have had some breast aversions. And so it's just so great to hear like all of the different information. Because I think like so many things in the baby world, there's so many points of views. And so being able to get some information that is like concrete and from a reputable source, I think can be really great for not only me, but listeners too. Um, so I think that's great. Is there anything else that you can think of or questions that you typically have clients coming in with when it comes to bottle or breast refusals and aversions that you often are hearing and answering when people come in?
Be careful of the marketing with bottled products. It's better to pay for the help sooner than spend all that money on bottles that are not going to work.
Right, because they're
Um,
just going to end up getting donated or trashed anyway.
right, right.
Right.
But if you get your baby to take a bottle, then your baby needs to get a bottle every day. Don't skip a day, because then they can start to reject it again. So
Yeah,
if a family does the suggestions we had talked about, sucking on the nipple, playing games with the nipple, and their baby starts taking a bottle at least once a day, you want to continue that, and keep it consistent.
absolutely. And are there any specific bottles that you prefer or find work often, more times than not, I guess you could say, because again, every baby's so different, that you typically suggest that, people try out if they're struggling, or ones that you suggest people just like start with from the start so that they are getting a good latch for baby?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is very individual,
Mm,
but for the most part, especially for young babies, I would say a nipple that's slow flow, but actual slow flow, because that's the other thing. They can call it whatever they want. Just because you're buying a nipple that
right.
says slow flow doesn't mean it's actually slow. But the pigeon bottle, for
Hmm.
example, which has a flow rate of, I believe, 8 to 10 mLs per minute. But it's got a wider base, but it's a gradual slope, so it's okay. And then the Dr. Brown's narrow nipple, I like for young babies too. So I
That's
would
great
say
to know.
those are my top two choices that I often reach for
Yeah.
when I'm doing a bottle consult.
I've also heard that for a lot of people, everyone gets all the bottles from their baby registries and from, free gifts all the time. And Dr. Brown's are one of the ones that the narrow ones are often in those. But I've also heard that the pigeon nipples themselves can be, attached to a lot of the different necks of other brands. And I don't know if that's true or not, or if you've heard this. But it
Yeah.
seems that like they can fit pretty well on some of the other bottles as well.
Yep, they can. You want to be careful with that because sometimes that can change the flow.
Oh, okay.
But I do find Pigeon actually owns Lancino.
Okay.
So the Lancino bottles and nipples are interchangeable and they don't impact the flow.
Oh,
Lancino
great.
nipples look exactly the same as Pigeon, but they're much, much faster. So I don't use them for young babies.
Gotcha.
But those two are interchangeable. I believe they would fit on the Spectra bottles too, but I don't know if that would change the flow. So you have to be careful when
Very
you're doing
interesting.
bottle hacks like that.
And very interesting. Good to know. I love it. I love it. Well, thank you so much for joining me and tackling this hefty topic. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Postpartum Plan podcast. I hope that today's episode brought you support, relatability, and valuable insight. Remember, you're not alone on this journey. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave a review and share with any of your prenatal and postpartum friends and family. Your feedback helps us reach more parents seeking support. And if you're looking for additional resources, please feel free to connect via Instagram at Serene Moments Doula for constant information, tips, and tricks, or check out my website, www.serenemomentsdoula.com. See you next week.